The last person anyone expected to still be awake in the castle was a child. It was well past the witching hour when the vampire king returned from his blood council. His immortal court waited in the shadowed halls. He walked alone through moonlit corridors, but then a sound. Not footsteps, not whispers. A heartbeat, rapid and terrified, coming from the kitchen pantry. He could smell her pulse before he saw her. Any other night, such a rhythm meant prey. Tonight, it meant something far more dangerous. He moved silently toward the pantry door and opened it without warning. There, crouched behind shelves of ancient silverware, was a little girl, honey blonde hair falling over wide, tear-filled eyes, shivering in a pink dress that looked too thin for the castle's eternal cold. In her trembling hands, a plate of cold roasted meat and half-eaten bread the kitchen staff had discarded. She wasn't an intruder. She wasn't a spy. She was starving. And when the vampire king stepped closer, this ancient predator who had walked the earth for 3 centuries, she whispered the words that shattered something he thought had died long ago. "Please don't hurt my mama. Please don't make her leave." His immortal heart, still for so long, stirred with forgotten emotion. His claws retracted. His eyes, usually cold as winter moonlight, softened. Her mother, Alana Donovan, his maid, the silent, invisible woman who kept his castle immaculate, who never complained, never asked for anything, never spoke of her life beyond these ancient stone walls. Now he understood why. The girl tried to hide the plate behind her back, as if protecting the scraps would protect her mother. As if her small body could shield against the wrath of an immortal king. For a long moment, Lucius Marcellus said nothing. Then he did something that would have shocked every vampire in his court, every servant in his household, every creature who knew his name and feared it. Stay with me until the end. Because what this vampire king did next, for a starving child and a mother dying from the very thing he thrived on, left every soul in that castle, living and undead, absolutely speechless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into the story of how an immortal monster remembered what it meant to be human. Lucius Marcellus had ruled from this castle for 300 years. 3 centuries of blood and shadow, of power absolute and unchallenged. The castle itself seemed built from darkness, black stone towers that pierced the night sky, corridors lit only by moonlight streaming through stained glass windows that depicted battles long forgotten by mortal history. Tapestries older than most nations hung on walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Everything within these walls bent to his will. Everything obeyed, without question, including Alana Donovan. She had worked in his household for 6 years. 6 years of silent, perfect service. She moved through the ancient halls like a ghost, polishing silver that hadn't tarnished in decades, arranging flowers in vases older than her great-grandmother, keeping the eternal dust of centuries at bay. Lucius could not remember ever hearing her voice above a whisper, could not recall her ever asking for anything, not a raise, not time off, not even a moment's acknowledgement. She was invisible by design. That's what good servants were supposed to be in a vampire's castle. Present when needed, gone when not. Silent, efficient, forgettable. He had forgotten her completely. Until tonight. Until her daughter's terrified face burned itself into his memory, refusing to fade even as dawn approached, and he retreated to his chambers. The girl's honey blonde hair. The way it caught what little light existed in that pantry. The pink dress that seemed absurdly bright against the shadows, like a flower growing in a graveyard. Those wide eyes, brimming with tears and terror and something worse, resignation. As if she'd already accepted her fate. As if she'd been hungry for so long that stealing scraps felt like mercy. "Please don't hurt my mama. Lucius stood before the window in his private quarters, watching the sun threaten the horizon. He should have been thinking about the Blood Council's political maneuvering, about territory disputes and ancient vampire law. Instead, he saw another face. Another pair of hollow eyes. 3 centuries old, that memory. His sister, mortal and dying, her body consuming itself in the final days before starvation claimed her. He'd been newly turned then, still learning what immortality meant, still unable to save the people he'd loved most. He'd promised himself he would never feel that helpless again. He returned to the pantry before the girl could be discovered by the morning staff. Ruby was still there, curled in the corner where he'd left her, the empty plate clutched to her chest like a shield. When she saw him, she flinched so violently she hit her head against the shelf behind her. Lucius stopped. Then slowly, so slowly it felt like moving through water, he lowered himself to one knee. The stone floor was cold even through his clothes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd knelt for anyone. Decades, perhaps. Maybe longer. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and his voice came out softer than he'd intended. Gentler than he'd spoken in years. "Or your mother. You have my word." Ruby's breath came in short, panicked gasps. Her fingers were white-knuckled around the plate. "Tell me your name."
Ruby.
A whisper, barely audible. "Ruby." He let the name settle between them. "How long have you been hungry, Ruby?" Her lower lip trembled. I don't." "The truth," he said quietly. "Please." Something in his tone must have reached her. Or perhaps she was simply too exhausted to lie anymore. The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling over each other like a dam breaking. Her mother's medicine. So expensive. The doctor said she needed it or her blood wouldn't clot right anymore, that she'd bleed from the inside. Mama working double shifts but still not having enough. Mama giving Ruby her portions at dinner, pretending she'd already eaten. The pantry visits starting 3 months ago. The cold leftovers. The guilt. "Mama doesn't know I follow her to work," Ruby whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She thinks I'm with the neighbor lady. But the neighbor lady fell asleep, and I just wanted to see where Mama works, and I got so hungry, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Lucius felt something ignite in his chest. Not the bloodlust he was accustomed to. This was older, hotter. Rage at himself for his centuries of blindness. Rage at a system that made people like Alana Donovan invisible until they collapsed. Rage at his own monstrous indifference. "You did nothing wrong," he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "The child is still here?" The voice came from the doorway. Sylvanus, his advisor, stood in the threshold with an expression of cold disapproval. 300 years old himself, silver-haired and sharp as a blade. "Lucius, the staff will arrive soon. If they find you here with a mortal child, then they will find me here with a mortal child." Lucius didn't rise, didn't look away from Ruby. "Under my protection." "Protection?" Sylvanus's tone sharpened. "She's a maid's daughter. A trespasser. She's a starving child in my castle." Lucius finally stood, placing himself between Ruby and the doorway, between the girl and his advisor. "And she will be treated as my guest. Is that understood?" The silence stretched thin and dangerous. "Perfectly," Sylvanus said at last, though his eyes promised a conversation later. He withdrew. Lucius turned back to Ruby, who stared up at him with something like wonder mixed with terror. "Come," he said gently, offering his hand. "Let's find you something warm to eat. And then we're going to talk about your mother." Dawn broke over the castle in shades of gray and gold. Lucius stood in the shadows of the upper gallery, where the sunrise couldn't reach him, and watched the servants' entrance below. He'd sent Ruby to sleep in one of the guest chambers, a room that hadn't been used in 50 years, but was still finer than anywhere she'd ever rested. Now he waited. Alana Donovan arrived precisely at 6, as she did every morning. But for the first time in 6 years, Lucius truly looked at her. The pallor of her skin wasn't the healthy fairness of someone who simply avoided the sun. It was the grayish-white of parchment, of something drained. Her hands trembled as she signed the staff log. Not with nervousness, with weakness. When she removed her coat, he could see how the uniform hung loose on her frame, how her collarbones jutted sharp beneath the fabric. How had he never noticed? Because she was invisible. Because he'd made her invisible. Because monsters don't see the mortals they're slowly killing. He descended the stairs in silence, his footsteps making no sound on the ancient stone. The other servants scattered at his approach. They always did. Lucius Marcellus didn't visit the servants' quarters. Ever. His presence here violated 3 centuries of careful separation between the immortal and the mortal, the powerful and the powerless. Alana stood frozen by the supply closet, a bundle of fresh linens in her arms. Her eyes went wide when she saw him. The linens nearly fell from her grip. Alana Donovan. His voice carried through the suddenly silent corridor. Sit down. The linens did fall then, scattering across the floor in a cascade of white. Every servant in the castle knew what those words meant. When the master told you to sit down, you were about to be dismissed. Fired. Cast out with no references, no future, no hope. Please. Alana's voice cracked. She didn't sit. She couldn't. Her legs were shaking too badly. Please, my lord. I can explain. Seat. Down. She collapsed onto the wooden bench against the wall, less sitting than falling. Her hands twisted in her lap, bloodless and trembling. Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. Years of practice at keeping emotion invisible. I don't know how she got in, Alana whispered desperately. Ruby wasn't supposed to. I never brought her here. I swear it, my lord. The neighbor was supposed to watch her, but she must have. Please, I need this position. I need the wages. The medicine costs so much, and if I lose this job, I can't. How long has your daughter been hungry? The question cut through her panic like a blade through silk. Alana stopped mid-sentence, her mouth still open, her eyes confused. What? Your daughter. Lucius moved closer, but didn't sit. Even now, some part of him couldn't quite break that final protocol, sitting beside his servants as equals. Ruby. How long has she been hungry? She's not. I feed her. The truth, Alana. I've already had it from the child. Cold leftovers in my pantry for 3 months. I want to hear it from you. The color that had been absent from her face drained even further. For a moment, Lucius thought she might faint. I give her my portions, Alana said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Every dinner. Every breakfast. I tell her I've already eaten at work, but I haven't. I can't afford enough food for both of us. Not with the medicine. Not with the rent. Not with. Her voice broke. I'm trying, my lord. I'm trying so hard, but it's never enough, and I didn't know she was following me here. I didn't know she was stealing. Please don't punish her. She's just a child. I'm not punishing anyone. The words came out rougher than he'd intended. But I am asking you a question, and I want an honest answer. He knelt then. Knelt in the servants' quarters, in front of a mortal woman who cleaned his floors. The other servants gasped. One dropped a tray. How long have you been ill, Alana? How long have you been dying in my house while I noticed nothing? The facade she'd maintained for 6 years shattered like glass. For years, Alana whispered. The diagnosis came 4 years ago. Von Willebrand disease. My blood doesn't clot properly anymore. I bleed internally, slowly. The medicine slows it down, but it's so expensive, and the doctors say I need treatments, transfusions, but those cost even more, and... She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth as if she could physically hold back the words. But they'd been trapped too long. They came anyway. I chose the medicine over food 6 months ago. I thought I could manage. I'm careful with portions, I make things stretch. But Ruby started looking so thin and I couldn't let her starve. So I gave her my meals and told her I'd eaten already. I thought I was hiding it well enough. I didn't know she could tell. I didn't know she was so desperate she'd follow me here and steal scraps like. Her voice cracked. Broke completely. I'm dying from blood loss, she said, and for the first time, she looked directly at him. Really looked at him. I'm dying from lack of blood while I scrub floors for a creature who survives on it. Do you understand how that feels, my lord? How perfectly, cruelly ironic that is. The words should have been angry, should have been an accusation. Instead, they were just exhausted, defeated. The sound of someone who'd accepted their fate and found it grimly funny. Lucius felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. Not guilt. Guilt was too small a word for this. This was the kind of shame that made 3 centuries feel like nothing. The kind that made immortality feel like a curse. He'd lived in opulence while his servant starved. He'd hoarded wealth beyond measure while a woman bled to death in his hallways. He'd been so consumed with maintaining his power, his reputation, his carefully constructed isolation from mortal suffering that he'd become exactly what he'd once feared becoming. A monster. Not because he drank blood, but because he'd stopped seeing the people who provided it. You will follow my orders, he said quietly. The fury in his voice was controlled now, forged into something harder. Something resolute. You will be treated. Today. This morning. I will summon the finest healers in the realm. My lord, I can't afford. I didn't ask what you could afford. His voice remained soft, but there was steel beneath it now. Ancient, unbreakable steel. I am immortal, Alana. I have more wealth than I can spend in 10 lifetimes. More gold than most kingdoms see in a century. It sits in vaults beneath this castle, doing nothing, meaning nothing. He stood, and the movement was both graceful and terrible, a reminder of what he was, what he could do. Your daughter was starving in my pantry. You were dying in my hallways. That ends now. But the cost is nothing. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time in decades, let his power show not as threat but as promise. The cost of your life? Of your daughter's hunger? That's nothing compared to the cost of my indifference. And I will not pay that price anymore. Alana stared at him, tears finally falling. Not from fear now. From something else entirely. Something that looked dangerously close to hope. You will move into the castle, Lucius continued. Both of you. You will have rooms near the guest quarters. Ruby will stay there while you undergo treatment. You will have access to the kitchen at all hours. You will eat 3 meals a day, prepared by my staff, with portions suitable for someone recovering from malnutrition. My lord. And you will accept this. The words were gentle but absolutely final. Because if you don't, if you walk out of this castle and continue to slowly die while your daughter starves, then I will have failed in the one thing that still matters after 3 centuries of existence. What's that? Alana whispered. Being worth the life I was given, Lucius said quietly. Even if that life is eternal. The silence that followed was broken only by Alana's quiet crying. But this time, she didn't try to hide it. Lucius sent for Magistra Celeste within the hour. She arrived by nightfall, traveling from the capital in a carriage marked with the silver serpent of the Healers' Guild. Ancient as Lucius himself, though she'd chosen a different path centuries ago, preserving life rather than taking it. Her white hair was bound in an intricate braid, and her eyes held the weight of 10,000 patients, mortal and immortal alike. Lucius Marcellus. She inclined her head as she entered his study, formal but not subservient. They'd known each other too long for pretense. Your message said urgent. A blood disorder in a mortal woman.
Von Willebrand disease.
For years progressed, severely malnourished, showing signs of internal bleeding. He gestured to the window overlooking the healing wing, where Alana had been taken an hour earlier. She's been working in my household while dying. I didn't see it. Something flickered in Celeste's expression. Not judgment. Something closer to understanding. And now you do. Now I do. The treatment will be extensive, Celeste said carefully. Transfusions, medicines, possibly surgical intervention if the damage is advanced. For a mortal of her condition, we're looking at months of care. The cost is an investment in my household. Lucius's tone left no room for negotiation. She stays here. You have full access to my resources. Whatever she needs. Celeste studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll begin the examination immediately. After she left, Sylvanus appeared in the doorway. He'd been waiting, clearly. His silver eyes were cold with disapproval. 100,000 gold, Sylvanus said without preamble. That's Celeste's fee for a mortal patient requiring months of intensive care. Plus the medicines. Plus the transfusions. Plus room and board for the woman and her child. He stepped into the study, closing the door behind him. You're planning to spend a fortune on a maid who earns 30 gold a month. I am. And the trust fund. Sylvanus's voice dropped to something dangerous. Tell me you're not serious about that. Completely serious. 50,000 for the child's education and future. Another 50,000 for Alana's long-term security and medical needs. Lucius poured himself wine, a habit from his mortal days, though it did nothing for him now. It's already arranged. The documents are being drawn up. That's insanity. Sylvanus moved closer, his voice sharp. Do you understand what the court will say? What the other houses will think? You'll look weak. Sentimental. Vampires don't spend fortunes on dying mortals, Lucius. We spend fortunes on power, on territory, on things that matter. She matters. A maid. A woman who is dying in my house while I notice nothing. Lucius turned to face him fully. Tell me, Sylvanus, how many mortals have you killed in 300 years? I don't keep count. Neither do I. Hundreds, probably. Maybe thousands. He set down the wine glass, untouched. I remember the girl's eyes. Rubies. The way she looked at me in that pantry, terrified but still trying to protect her mother. Still clutching those scraps like they were precious. He paused, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. I no longer remember most of my victims' faces. They blur together after a while. Decades of prey, all looking the same in their final moments. He met Sylvanus's gaze. Tell me, old friend, which should concern me more, that I'm spending too much gold on a mortal woman's life? Or that I've forgotten the faces of the people I've killed while I remember every detail of a starving child's fear? Sylvanus said nothing. For the first time in their long association, he looked uncertain. I have eternity, Lucius continued quietly. Eternity to accumulate wealth. Eternity to maintain power. But if I lose what's left of my humanity, if I become so monstrous that I can't even see suffering when it's bleeding on my floors, then what's the point of any of it? The point, Sylvanus said carefully, is survival. Power. Dominance. Perhaps. Lucius turned back to the window, watching as lamplight flickered in the healing wing. Or perhaps being a monster isn't something worth being for eternity. Sylvanus left without another word. The door closed with a soft, final click. Lucius stood alone in the study, looking out at his castle, his domain, his prison, his empire, and wondered when exactly he'd stopped being its master and started being its captive. They brought Ruby to the castle at dusk. She arrived in one of the household carriages, clutching a small cloth bag that held everything she owned: 2 dresses, a wooden doll with half its paint worn away, and a ribbon her mother had given her for her last birthday. The servant who'd collected her from their modest apartment in the lower city reported that the girl hadn't spoken a single word during the entire journey. Lucius found her in the grand entrance hall, standing frozen on the black marble floor. She looked impossibly small beneath the vaulted ceiling, dwarfed by stone columns that rose 30 feet into shadow. Tapestries depicting ancient battles loomed above her. Moonlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting her honey-blonde hair in shades of crimson and gold. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she stared at everything and nothing. "Ruby." She spun toward his voice, nearly dropping her bag. Fresh terror flooded her features, the instinctive fear mortals had when confronted with predators. But Lucius moved slowly, carefully, the way he'd learned to move around her. He knelt, just as he had in the pantry, just as he had in the servants' quarters. The marble was cold beneath his knee. "Your mama is being healed," he said gently. "The finest healer in the realm is caring for her right now. She's going to be well again." Ruby's lower lip trembled. I didn't mean to get her in trouble." "You didn't." He kept his voice soft, steady. "You did nothing wrong, Ruby. Nothing at all. Hunger is not a sin, child. It's never a sin to need food, to need care, to need safety." He paused, then added, "The sin was mine. For not seeing. For not helping when I should have." She stared at him with those wide eyes, less terrified now, but still lost. Still adrift in a world too large and strange for a child who'd spent her life making herself small and invisible. "You're going to stay here while your mama recovers," Lucius continued. "In a room fit for a princess, not a pantry. You'll have warm meals and soft beds, and no one will make you feel small again." "But I am small," Ruby whispered.
"I'm nobody."
"Mama says we have to be grateful for what we have because people like us don't matter to people like—" She stopped, her eyes widening as she realized what she'd almost said. "People like you." The words hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Lucius felt something crack in his chest. 3 centuries of carefully constructed distance, of emotional isolation, of treating mortals as lesser, all of it crystallized in a child's innocent truth. "Come with me," he said, standing and offering his hand. Ruby hesitated, then placed her small hand in his. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin. Mortal heat. Living heat. He led her toward the grand staircase, the one reserved for visiting nobility, for vampire lords and ancient dignitaries. No servant had ever walked these steps. It was tradition, protocol, an unspoken law as old as the castle itself. Lucius guided Ruby onto the first step. The hall fell silent. Every servant, every guard, every vampire courtier who happened to be passing froze.
Stared.
The vampire king, escorting a mortal child in a faded pink dress up the grand staircase. The child's hand in his, moving slowly so she could keep pace, breaking 300 years of tradition with every step. Sylvanus appeared at the top of the landing, his face carefully blank. But his eyes spoke volumes. "This is madness." Lucius met his gaze and continued climbing. Ruby's hand tightened around his fingers. They reached the top. The private wing. The corridors where only Lucius and his most trusted advisors were permitted. He led her to a door carved with roses and wolves, a guest suite that had housed queens and empresses in centuries past. "This is your room," he said, opening the door. Ruby stepped inside and stopped. The suite was larger than her entire apartment. Silk curtains, a bed with posts carved like forest trees, windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. A fireplace already crackling with warm flames. "I'll have dinner brought up," Lucius said. Whatever you'd like. Ruby turned to him, confusion written across her face. What do you mean? What would you like to eat? She blinked.
Once. Twice.
As if he'd asked the question in a foreign language. I've never been asked that before, she whispered. And Lucius realized that in all her 7 years of life, no one had ever cared enough to ask Ruby what she wanted. She'd eaten what was available, what was left over, what others decided she deserved. You're being asked now, he said quietly. So, tell me, what would make you happy? The castle's head chef arrived within minutes, a portly man named Henrik who'd served the household for 40 years. He bowed to Lucius, then turned to Ruby with the same deference he'd show visiting royalty. Young miss, Henrik said warmly, his accent thick with the old country. What would please you this evening? We have roasted duck with cherry glaze, beef tenderloin in wine sauce, fresh trout from the mountain streams, lamb with rosemary and garlic. I don't know what those things are, Ruby whispered, shrinking back. Henrik's expression softened. Then let me bring you a selection, yes? A proper feast for a proper young lady. Could I just have warm bread and soup? Ruby's voice was so quiet Lucius almost missed it. Please? If it's not too much trouble? The chef looked stricken, as if she'd asked for gruel instead of a banquet. He glanced at Lucius, uncertain. Warm bread and soup, Lucius repeated gently, crouching down to Ruby's level again. Is that truly all you want? She nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. I don't want to be wasteful. Mama always says wasting food is wrong when people are hungry. And I've never had duck or those other things, so I wouldn't know if I liked them anyway, and if I didn't like them then it would be wasted and… Ruby. He waited until she looked at him. Nothing you eat here will be wasted. Not a single bite. If you want to try something and decide you don't like it, that's not waste. That's learning. That's being a child. Her breath hitched. But the cost. There is no cost. The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended. He softened his tone. Not for you. Not anymore. You can have bread and soup tonight. Tomorrow, you can have bread and soup again if you wish. Or you can try the duck. Or the lamb. Or anything else your heart desires. Do you understand? Ruby stared at him for a long moment. Then, in a voice so small it nearly broke him, why are you being so nice to me? Lucius felt the question like a blade between his ribs. Why was he being nice? Because he'd seen his sister's face in her terrified eyes. Because 3 centuries of power had made him blind to suffering. Because a child had been starving in his castle, and he'd noticed nothing. Because somewhere in the darkness of his immortal existence, he'd forgotten that mercy was a choice, and he was choosing it now, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it meant. Because you deserve kindness, he said simply. And because I should have offered it long ago. Henrik brought the bread and soup himself, presenting it on silver plates that probably cost more than Alana's yearly wages. The bread was fresh from the oven, still steaming, with butter melting into golden pools. The soup was thick with vegetables and chicken, fragrant with herbs. Ruby ate slowly, reverently, as if afraid the food might vanish if she moved too quickly. Lucius sat across from her in his private dining hall, a room that had hosted vampire lords and dark nobility, now occupied by a child in a faded dress eating soup. When she finished, she set down her spoon with careful precision and looked at him with those heartbreaking eyes. The servant who brought me here said I'm staying in the castle, she said quietly. Is that true? It is. For how long? As long as necessary. Your mother needs time to heal. Weeks, probably. Maybe months. Ruby's hands twisted in her lap. And where will I stay? In the servants' quarters? I promise I'll be quiet. I won't cause any trouble. I can help with chores, I'm good at sweeping, and… You'll stay here. Lucius gestured to the suite beyond the dining area. These rooms. right beside my own chambers. The color drained from her face. But these are for important people. For nobles and kings and for people under my protection, Lucius interrupted gently. Which you are. Even though I'm nobody important? The question came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding it back and couldn't contain it anymore. Even though I'm just human? Even though I broke into your pantry and stole food and caused trouble for Mama and… Stop. The word was soft but absolute. Ruby fell silent. Lucius rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her again. This was becoming a habit, he realized. Kneeling for a mortal child. Breaking himself open in ways he hadn't done in centuries. Listen to me carefully, Ruby, he said, his voice low and steady. You are under my protection now. Do you know what that means? She shook her head. It means that in this castle, you are royalty. It means that anyone who would harm you would have to go through me first. It means that you are not invisible anymore, little one. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her small hand in his cold one. Not in these halls. Not ever again. But I'm just… You are Ruby. He said her name like it meant something. Like it was important. You are brave enough to protect your mother even when you're terrified. You are strong enough to go hungry so she could eat. You are valuable not because of what you are, but because of who you are. He paused, then added quietly, and you matter to me. The words hung in the air between them, true and terrifying. Ruby stared at him with wide eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. But for the first time since he'd found her in the pantry, they weren't tears of fear. Really, she whispered. Really, Lucius confirmed. And in that moment, 3 centuries of careful emotional distance shattered completely. He'd chosen this. Chosen her. Chosen to care about a mortal child's tears when he'd spent lifetimes causing them. For the first time in 300 years, Lucius Marcellus felt like he might finally understand what it meant to be human again. 6 months passed like pages turning in an ancient book. The castle's dark spires remained unchanged against the sky. The stone walls still held 3 centuries of shadow and secrets. The stained glass windows still painted moonlight in shades of blood and gold. From the outside, nothing had transformed. But within those ancient halls, everything had changed. Alana Donovan walked through the corridors with her head held high, color in her cheeks, strength in her step. The trembling woman who'd collapsed in the servants' quarters was gone, replaced by someone who moved with quiet confidence and authority. Magistra Celeste's treatments had worked. The blood disorder was managed, controlled, no longer a death sentence. The gray pallor had vanished. The weakness had faded. She was no longer invisible. Lucius had promoted her to keeper of the royal household, a position of genuine power. She managed the staff now, oversaw the castle's operations, held keys to rooms that had been locked for decades. The other servants no longer saw through her. They saw her, respected her, answered to her authority. She wore deep green now instead of servant's gray. She gave orders instead of taking them. And when she smiled at her daughter across the dinner table in the great hall, it was the smile of someone who no longer had to choose between medicine and food. Ruby had transformed too, though in different ways. She'd grown taller. Proper meals would do that. Her honey blonde hair was lustrous now, healthy, often adorned with ribbons from the castle's seamstress. The pink dress had been replaced by a dozen others, though she still kept it folded carefully in her wardrobe. A reminder, Lucius suspected, of who she'd been. She spent her mornings in the castle library, learning to read from tutors Lucius had hired from the capital. Ancient texts and languages, both mortal and immortal, surrounded her, and she absorbed knowledge like parched earth absorbing rain. Her laughter echoed through corridors that hadn't heard a child's joy in centuries. And Lucius, The ancient vampire king who'd once measured time in decades now measured it in Ruby's lessons. "Did you practice your reading today?" he'd ask at dinner. "I read 3 whole pages by myself," she'd announce proudly, and he'd listen to every word about adventures in fairy tales and histories of kingdoms long fallen. The vampire court watched all of this with varying degrees of shock, disapproval, and fascination. "He's going soft," they whispered in the shadowed alcoves. The vampire king, domesticated by a mortal child. The whispers reached their peak when Lord Dimitri, an ambitious vampire from the Eastern Territories, decided to test Lucius's supposed weakness. He challenged Lucius's authority during a blood council meeting, suggesting that perhaps someone less distracted by mortal concerns should lead. Lucius had crushed the rebellion in under 3 minutes. Not with words, not with politics, with the raw, absolute power that had kept him on the throne for 3 centuries. He'd moved faster than mortal eyes could follow, his hand at Dimitri's throat, lifting the challenger off the ground with casual, terrifying ease. "I have not gone soft," Lucius had said quietly, his voice colder than winter death. "I have simply remembered what power is actually for. It is not diminished by mercy. It is not weakened by compassion. It is only wasted when used for nothing but itself." He'd released Dimitri, who collapsed gasping to the floor. "Anyone else wish to question whether I've lost my edge?" Lucius had asked the assembled court. The silence had been absolute. The message was clear: compassion and absolute power could coexist. A king could be ruthless when challenged and tender when needed. The two were not contradictions, they were complements. After that, the whispers changed. Rumors spread through the supernatural world, carried by traveling vampires, shared in dark courts across the realm. The vampire king had changed. The vampire king had an heir. Not another immortal. Not a vampire he'd turned. A mortal child. A girl with honey-blonde hair who sat at his right hand during formal dinners, who fell asleep reading in the library and woke to find herself carried to bed by a creature who could tear apart armies. A child who'd somehow turned one of the realm's most feared immortals into someone who remembered to ask about spelling lessons and made sure the kitchen always had warm bread. Some called it weakness. Others called it fascinating. A few, the very old ones who remembered their own mortal lives, called it hope. The vampire king, they said, was learning to be human again. And in the castle's highest tower, Lucius stood at his window overlooking the moonlit gardens, watching Ruby play with the castle's dogs in the courtyard below. Her laughter drifted up to him, bright and alive and utterly mortal. 3 centuries of existence, and this simple moment of a child's happiness felt more significant than any battle he'd won, any territory he'd claimed, any power he'd seized. He was no longer just surviving eternity. He was finally living it. Ruby found him in his study on a quiet evening when autumn had begun to paint the castle gardens in shades of amber and gold. She knocked. She always knocked now, though he'd told her a dozen times she didn't need to, and entered clutching something against her chest. Her tutor had dismissed her an hour earlier, but instead of going to the library or the gardens as she usually did, she'd apparently been working on something in her room. "I made something for you," she said, suddenly shy in that way children became when offering gifts they weren't sure would be valued. Lucius set down the treaty he'd been reviewing, some territorial dispute between vampire houses that suddenly seemed infinitely less important. "Show me." Ruby approached his desk and carefully unfolded a piece of parchment. It was a drawing, done in colored pencils the castle's art tutor had given her. The style was childish, imperfect, but rendered with obvious care and thought. 2 figures stood side by side. The taller one wore a crown and had long silver hair, clearly meant to be him, though she'd drawn his face much kinder than he suspected it actually was. The smaller figure had honey-blonde hair and wore a pink dress. They were holding hands. Above them, in careful lettering that showed she'd been practicing her writing, were two words: my family. Something in Lucius's chest, that immortal heart that had been still for so long, stuttered and cracked open completely. Do you like it? Ruby asked softly, uncertainty creeping into her voice. I know it's not very good. The proportions are wrong and your face is probably not quite right, and… It's perfect, Lucius said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. He took the drawing with careful hands, as if it were more precious than all the ancient texts in his library. Ruby, this is perfect. She smiled then, radiant and relieved. I wanted you to have it, because you gave me a family when I thought I'd lost everything. You saved Mama. You saved me. You made us matter. You always mattered, he said quietly. I simply failed to see it, but you see it now. She said it with such simple confidence, such absolute trust. And that's what counts, right? That's what Mama says. People can change if they choose to. People can change if they choose to. 3 centuries of existence. 300 years of carefully constructed emotional distance, of viewing mortals as lesser, as temporary, as ultimately insignificant. 300 years of accumulating power for its own sake, of building an empire with no one to share it with, no one to protect, no one to love. What was the point of any of it? He'd conquered territories and crushed enemies and amassed wealth beyond measure. He'd survived plagues and wars and the rise and fall of kingdoms. He'd become one of the most powerful immortals in the realm. And until 6 months ago, until a starving child in a pink dress had looked at him with terrified eyes and begged him not to hurt her mother, none of it had meant anything at all. Ruby, he said carefully, how would you feel about staying here permanently? Not just while your mother works, but as part of my household. As the word caught in his throat, foreign after so many centuries. As my daughter. Ruby's eyes went wide. You mean adopted? Like really adopted? With papers and everything. With papers and everything. You and your mother would both be protected under my name. You'd be my heir. The castle would be your home, truly, not just temporarily. But I'm mortal, she whispered. I'll grow old, and you won't. I'll die, and you'll still be here, and I will have had the privilege of watching you grow, Lucius interrupted gently. Of knowing you, of being your father for whatever time we have. He paused, then added quietly, Immortality is not a gift if you spend it alone, Ruby. I learned that the hard way. She threw her arms around him then, this small mortal child embracing an ancient predator, and he held her carefully, precisely, as if she were made of glass and starlight. I'd like that, she whispered against his shoulder. I'd like that very much. Lucius summoned his legal advisor the next morning. Not for territorial negotiations. Not for vampire law and political maneuvering. For adoption documents. For the legal recognition that this mortal child was his heir, his daughter, his family. The advisor worked for 3 days straight, drawing up papers that had never been needed before in the castle's 3-century history. Papers that declared a mortal girl the adopted daughter and heir of the vampire king. When the documents were complete, Lucius signed them with the same hand that had signed treaties and death warrants. Then Alana signed, tears streaming down her healthy, color-filled cheeks. Then Ruby, her careful childish signature looking small and precious next to the others. Family is not blood. Family is choice. That evening, Lucius stood in the moonlit courtyard with Ruby's hand in his. The castle rose around them, ancient and eternal, but no longer empty. No longer cold. What are you thinking about? Ruby asked, looking up at him. That true power, Lucius said quietly, lies not in domination, but in protection. Not in taking, but in giving. Not in standing alone, but in standing beside someone you love. Ruby smiled and squeezed his hand. That's a very wise thing to say. I learned it from a very wise little girl, he replied. Above them, stars wheeled through the eternal sky. The castle's dark spires reached toward heaven. And within those ancient walls, a vampire who'd spent 3 centuries becoming a monster finally remembered what it meant to be human. Not through mortality, but through love.